every civilization tells a story about where it began. Not because the beginning is always clear, but because without one, the rest of the story feels unanchored. For Rome, this problem was especially acute. The city that would one day rule an empire stretching from Britain to the deserts of Syria could not afford a vague or accidental origin. Its people believed that greatness required purpose, and purpose required a beginning that felt inevitable. Yet Rome's earliest centuries lay beyond living memory, in a time without written records, where history blurred into legend. What the Romans inherited was not a clear past, but fragments, songs, rituals, family traditions, sacred places, and stories passed from one generation to the next. From these fragments, they would attempt to construct something stable, a beginning they could point to, repeat, and teach. The date we now associate with Rome's founding, 753 BCE, was not discovered, it was chosen. Ancient historians did not stumble upon this year through excavation or archival research. They arrived at it through calculation, interpretation, and debate. Some worked backward from later events. Others aligned Roman history with Greek chronologies. Still others relied on priestly records and ceremonial calendars whose meanings were already contested in antiquity. Even among the Romans themselves, there was no consensus. Some believed Rome was far older than tradition claimed, tracing its roots deep into the aftermath of the Trojan War. Others argued it was younger, little more than a collection of villages slowly growing together over time. Different authors proposed different dates, sometimes separated by decades or even centuries. Yet over time, one date endured. 753 BCE became Rome's official point of origin, not because it was indisputable, but because it was useful. It provided a shared reference point, a moment from which Roman time itself could be measured. Years could now be counted ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city. To modern eyes, this may seem like a technical detail, but to the Romans it mattered profoundly. A fixed beginning allowed Rome to see itself as something complete, something whole. It transformed a gradual process into a decisive act. Rome was no longer merely a place that happened to grow. It became a city that was founded. And foundation implies intention. But intention raises questions. Who intended it? For what purpose? And at what cost? Rome's founding story does not begin with peace, cooperation, or mutual agreement. It begins with exile, abandonment, rivalry, and blood. This was not accidental. The Romans could have chosen a gentler story. Instead, they preserved one that was unsettling even by ancient standards. They told of brothers who could not coexist, of sacred boundaries enforced through violence, of a city born from both divine favor and human crime. This is where the problem of beginnings becomes something deeper than chronology. Rome's origin myth was not designed to comfort, it was designed to explain. To the Romans, the hardships of their later history, the civil wars, the betrayals, the relentless expansion, the suffering inflicted and endured, did not contradict their founding story. They confirmed it. Rome had been forged through conflict from the very start. Struggle was not a deviation from Roman destiny, it was its defining feature. In this way, the myth served as both explanation and justification. If Rome's founder had shed blood to establish the city, then violence was not shameful, it was foundational. If Rome had welcomed outcasts and fugitives at its birth, then social tension and diversity were not weaknesses but sources of strength. If the gods themselves had sanctioned the city's creation, then Rome's rise was not merely fortunate, it was deserved. This does not mean the Romans believed their myths literally in the modern sense. Educated Romans understood that stories evolved, that poets embellished, and that traditions shifted. But they also believed that myths carried truth of a different kind, not factual truth, but moral and cultural truth. Myth explained why Rome was the way it was. It explained why law mattered so deeply, yet was born from force. Why order was sacred, yet fragile. Why Rome feared internal division more than external enemies. And crucially, it explained why Rome endured. A city that began in perfection might crumble at the first sign of disorder, but a city born in chaos, tempered by rivalry and loss, could survive almost anything. This is why the Romans never erased the darker parts of their origin story. They did not soften the murder. They did not remove the conflict. They did not hide the ambiguity. Instead, they placed it at the very center of their identity. Rome did not pretend to be innocent. In doing so, it offered its citizens a powerful lesson. Greatness is not inherited, it is forged. The problem of beginnings, then, was never about finding the correct date. It was about deciding what kind of city Rome believed itself to be. The year 753 BCE became a symbol, a line drawn between chaos and order, between wilderness and law. What mattered was not whether Rome truly began in that year. What mattered was that the Romans agreed it did. Because once a beginning is accepted, it shapes everything that follows. It determines how a people understand their past, justify their present, and imagine their future. And so, before Rome became an empire, before it became a republic, before it became a city of stone and marble, it first became a story, one that began not with certainty, but with choice. A choice that Rome would live with for more than 1,000 years. Before Rome existed as a city, Italy was not a nation. It was a landscape. A long peninsula stretching into the Mediterranean, Italy was defined less by borders than by geography. Mountains ran like a spine down its length, dividing regions and isolating communities. Rivers carved corridors through forests and plains. Coastlines opened outward to the wider sea, inviting contact, trade, and invasion. In this world, identity was local. People did not think of themselves as Italians. They were members of tribes, clans, and villages, bound to particular valleys, hills, and river crossings. Loyalty was personal and immediate. Power was fragmented. No single city dominated the peninsula, and no shared political vision united its peoples. Central Italy, the region where Rome would eventually rise, was a zone of constant interaction and tension. It lay between more developed civilizations to the north and south, absorbing influences from both while remaining politically unsettled. To the north lived the Etruscans. They were the most advanced urban society in the region, skilled in metallurgy, engineering, and religious ritual. Their cities were planned, fortified, and wealthy. Their kings ruled with authority, and their religious specialists claimed insight into the will of the gods through signs and omens. To the south lay the Greek world. Along the southern coasts of Italy, Greek colonies flourished. They brought with them writing, monumental architecture, philosophy, and a long tradition of recorded history. Through trade and contact, Greek ideas filtered northward, shaping how other peoples understood time, myth, and civilization itself. Between these two spheres lived the Latin peoples. They were farmers, herders, and small-scale warriors, organized into villages scattered across hills and plains. Their settlements were modest, their political structures informal, and their traditions deeply rooted in land and ancestry. They were not isolated, but they were not unified either. What made central Italy significant was not its wealth or power, but its position. The region sat at the crossroads of movement. Rivers served as natural highways. Hills provided defensible ground. Trade routes passed through narrow corridors that could be controlled by whoever settled them. Among these, one river in particular would shape Rome's destiny. The Tiber did not dominate the landscape, but it connected it. Flowing from the Apennine Mountains to the sea, the river linked inland communities with the coast. It could be crossed at certain points, creating natural meeting places. One such crossing lay near a cluster of low hills, close enough to the sea for trade, but far enough inland to avoid constant coastal threats. This area was not remarkable at first glance. The land was marshy in places. The hills were modest, not imposing. There were no ancient temples or grand cities, but what it offered was balance, access without exposure, connection without vulnerability. Long before Rome existed, people lived here. Archaeological evidence suggests that small settlements dotted the hills overlooking the river. These communities were separate, each with its own identity, traditions, and leadership. They did not yet think of themselves as a single people, and they did not yet share a single destiny. What they shared was proximity. Over time, proximity creates pressure. Trade increases, disputes arise, alliances form and dissolve. Shared threats encourage cooperation even among rivals. Slowly, boundaries soften, not through grand design but through necessity. This is how cities are often born. Not in a single moment, but through accumulation. Yet Rome's later story required something different. It required a beginning that felt deliberate, a moment when disorder gave way to structure, a founder who transformed scattered communities into something unified. This is why the myth of Rome's founding does not begin with gradual growth. It begins with decision. But that decision did not occur in a vacuum. The world around early Rome was competitive and unstable. Stronger powers pressed inward. Weaker communities struggled to survive. Violence was common, but so was adaptation. Those who endured were those who learned quickly, borrowed freely, and held together under pressure. Rome would later claim uniqueness, but its earliest character was shaped by imitation. From the Etruscans, it absorbed religious rituals, symbols of authority, and techniques of construction. From the Greeks, it inherited stories, gods, and ways of thinking about the past. From its Latin neighbors, it drew language, customs, and social structures. Rome was not born pure. It was born mixed. This mixture would become one of its defining strengths. A city formed at the intersection of cultures learned early how to absorb difference without dissolving. It learned how to adapt without losing cohesion. It learned that survival required flexibility as much as force. The landscape reinforced this lesson. The hills provided defense but not isolation. The river offered connection but not security. The surrounding plains could sustain agriculture but only if managed collectively. No single village could dominate the region alone. Cooperation was not idealism, it was survival. In this sense, Rome's environment prepared it for its future long before its myths did. When later Romans looked back on their origins, they did not imagine a peaceful countryside disturbed by sudden ambition. They imagined a harsh world that demanded resilience. Their founding stories reflect this environment, not as a backdrop, but as a teacher. Rome did not emerge because the land was generous. It emerged because the land was demanding. And so, before Romulus, before the walls, before the date we remember, there was a place shaped by movement, tension, and opportunity. A place where cultures met, clashed, and blended. A place where no one yet ruled, but many struggled to endure. Rome would rise here not because it was destined by geography alone, but because its people learned early on how to live within complexity. The city was still centuries away, but the conditions that made it possible were already in place. Rome did not place its origins only in Italy. It placed them far away, across the sea, in the ruins of another world. Long before Rome was founded, long before even the earliest Latin villages, the Romans believed their story began with the fall of Troy. This was not a minor detail. It was a deliberate choice. By anchoring their origins in the most famous war of the ancient world, the Romans connected themselves to a shared Mediterranean memory, one already rich with heroism, loss, and meaning. At the center of this story stood Aeneas. Aeneas was not the greatest warrior of Troy. He was not known for cunning like Odysseus, nor for rage like Achilles. His defining trait was something else entirely: duty. When Troy fell, burning, betrayed, and beyond saving, Aeneas did not stay to die gloriously among the ruins. He fled. This decision mattered. In Roman eyes, Aeneas embodied pietas, devotion to family, gods, and destiny. He carried his aging father on his shoulders. He led his son by the hand. He rescued the household gods of Troy and carried them into exile. Troy's future, the Romans believed, survived not in its walls but in this act of preservation. The journey that followed was long and uncertain. Aeneas wandered the Mediterranean, driven by prophecy but obstructed by fate. Storms scattered his fleet. Wars broke out wherever he landed. Lovers were lost. Allies turned into enemies. The gods themselves intervened, sometimes to help, sometimes to delay. This wandering mattered as much as the destination. Rome did not imagine its ancestors as conquerors from the start. It imagined them as refugees, survivors of catastrophe, people forced to adapt, to endure, and to continue forward despite loss. This theme would echo throughout Roman history. Eventually, Aeneas reached Italy. The land he arrived in was not empty nor welcoming. Local kings ruled over established peoples. Alliances had to be negotiated. Conflicts erupted. Once again, Aeneas did not simply take the land. He fought for it, married into it, and merged with it. Through this union, Trojan blood became Latin blood. From Aeneas' line came kings. From those kings came generations. And from those generations came a city yet to be founded. This genealogical bridge allowed Rome to claim both antiquity and legitimacy. It was not merely a new settlement. It was the continuation of an ancient story. Importantly, the Romans did not claim to descend from the victors of Troy, but from the defeated. This too was a choice. By aligning themselves with Troy rather than Greece, the Romans positioned themselves as inheritors rather than imitators of Greek civilization. They could adopt Greek culture while remaining distinct from it. They could admire Greek achievement without submitting to Greek identity. Troy, in Roman memory, represented dignity in defeat, a civilization destroyed not because it lacked virtue, but because fate demanded its end. This allowed Rome to see itself as both successor and redeemer, a city that would carry forward what Troy could not preserve. The story also solved another problem. Rome needed antiquity. In the ancient world, age conferred authority. Older cities claimed deeper wisdom, stronger gods, and greater legitimacy. Greece had centuries of recorded history. Its myths stretched back into a distant, heroic age. Rome, by comparison, was young. By tracing its lineage to Troy, Rome extended its past backward into mythic time. Suddenly, Rome was no longer a latecomer. It was ancient. Its roots reached into the same heroic era as Homer's epics. Its destiny was intertwined with the greatest stories ever told. Yet even here, uncertainty remained. Different Roman authors told different versions of Aeneas' story. Some emphasized peace, others emphasized war. Some presented his arrival as divinely guaranteed, others portrayed it as fragile and contested. This variability did not weaken the myth, it strengthened it. Because the myth was not meant to be precise. It was meant to be meaningful. The journey of Aeneas explained why Rome valued endurance over brilliance, duty over impulse, continuity over perfection. It explained why Rome respected tradition even as it adapted to change. And it explained why Rome saw suffering not as failure, but as preparation. Rome was not born from triumph alone. It was born from survival. By the time the story reached Latium, the land where Rome would eventually rise, the pattern was clear. Greatness did not arrive fully formed. It emerged slowly through loss, migration, compromise, and conflict. This perspective shaped how Romans understood their own future. When disasters struck, when armies were defeated, when cities burned, When civil wars tore the state apart, Romans could look back to Aeneas and see precedent. Rome had always been tested. Rome had always endured. In this way, the myth did more than explain the past. It offered reassurance about the future. Rome's beginning was not a moment of purity. It was a continuation of displacement, a new chapter written by those who refused to disappear. And so, before Romulus, before the wolf, before the riverbank, Rome's story already carried weight. It was already ancient, already burdened with destiny, already shaped by the belief that survival itself was sacred. The city had not yet been founded, but the idea of Rome was already in motion. As Rome's mythic past moves closer to the moment of its founding, the scale of the story narrows. Vast migrations and distant wars give way to something more intimate and more dangerous. Power concentrates within a single family. In the city of Alba Longa, founded generations after Aeneas' arrival in Italy, kingship was meant to follow bloodlines. Authority passed from father to son, preserving continuity and stability. But like many royal successions, this one did not unfold peacefully. The rightful king was Numitor. He ruled by tradition and lineage, not by force. Yet kingship based on legitimacy is often vulnerable to ambition. Numitor's younger brother, Amulius, seized power through violence, overthrowing Numitor and driving him from the throne. Usurpation is never complete unless it secures the future. Amulius understood that as long as Numitor's descendants lived, his rule remained fragile. Sons could rally supporters. Bloodlines could reassert themselves. To prevent this, Amulius eliminated Numitor's male heirs. But one threat remained. Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, still carried the potential to produce heirs. To neutralize her without openly killing her, Amulius forced her into the priesthood of the Vestal Virgins, a sacred office that required lifelong chastity. This was political calculation disguised as piety. By binding Rhea Silvia to vows of celibacy, Amulius believed he had secured his throne. The gods, however, did not remain silent in the story that followed. According to tradition, Rhea Silvia was visited by Mars, the god of war, and became pregnant. Whether this union was divine or symbolic mattered less than its outcome. She gave birth to twin sons. The children represented everything Amulius feared, living proof of Numitor's bloodline and potential rivals to his authority. The response was immediate and ruthless. The twins were ordered killed. But even here, the story hesitates. Rather than murdering the infants outright, the king's servants placed them in a basket and set them adrift on the Tiber River. This act occupies a strange space between mercy and murder, an attempt to let fate accomplish what human hands would not. The river, swollen by seasonal floods, carried the basket downstream. In Roman memory, this moment mattered deeply. The future of Rome did not begin with protection or care. It began with exposure. The city's founders entered the world unwanted, abandoned by power, and surrendered to chance. Yet chance did not take them. The basket ran aground near the base of the Palatine Hill. There, according to legend, the twins were discovered by a she-wolf, who suckled them and kept them alive until a shepherd found them and took them in. Whether this scene is meant to be read literally or symbolically has long been debated, but its meaning within Roman culture was clear. Rome's founders were shaped by the wilderness. They were nourished by something untamed, something outside human society. This origin set them apart. The twins grew up not as princes but as shepherds. Their lives were marked by physical labor, danger, and conflict. They learned leadership not through instruction, but through action. They gathered followers, defended territory, and imposed authority among peers. In these stories, we see Rome imagining its ideal founder. Not refined, not gentle, but capable. As young men, The twins eventually came into conflict with Alba Longa's authority. One of them was captured and brought before Numitor. In a moment of recognition, whether through appearance, age, or coincidence, Numitor realized who they were. The truth of their lineage emerged. The twins confronted Amulius, overthrew him, and restored Numitor to the throne. Order temporarily was re-established. Justice, by the logic of the story, had been served. And yet the myth does not end here. This moment is crucial because it presents an alternative future, one in which the twins might have remained in Alba Longa, content with restored legitimacy and inherited stability. They could have become princes within an existing city, beneficiaries of an old order. They chose otherwise. Instead of ruling where power already existed, they turned back toward the river and the hills where they had been abandoned. They chose to found something new. This decision is not explained as necessity, it is portrayed as will. Rome, in this telling, is not born because the twins had nowhere else to go. It is born because they refused to be absorbed into an old system. They sought to create their own city on their own terms, shaped by their own experience. Yet from the beginning, tension followed them. The twins were alike in origin, in upbringing, and in ambition, but they were not identical in temperament. Rivalry had always simmered beneath their bond, and now it rose to the surface. Who would rule? Where would the city stand? Whose authority would prevail? The myth does not portray this conflict as tragic misunderstanding. It presents it as inevitable. Two leaders cannot easily share one foundation. Unity in Rome's story is not achieved through consensus. It is achieved through resolution. Often violent resolution. Before the first stone was laid, before the first wall was raised, Rome's founding was already marked by political struggle, familial betrayal, and the shadow of bloodshed. The pattern that began with Numitor and Amulius now reappeared in a new generation. Power once again would demand a price. And so the story moves toward its most famous moment, not as an isolated act, but as the culmination of a cycle that had repeated itself from the very beginning. Rome's birth was approaching, and it would not be peaceful. Before Rome had walls, before it had laws, before it even had a name, it had a river. The Tiber was not a symbol at first. It was a force, unpredictable, dangerous, and indifferent. Its floods destroyed crops and settlements, but they also carried life, trade, and possibility. To live near the river was to accept risk in exchange for connection. It was into this uncertain space that the twins were cast. When the servants of Amulius placed the infants into the water, the act was meant to erase them without direct guilt. The river would decide. Fate would intervene, or it would not. Human responsibility ended at the riverbank. But the river did not carry them away. Instead, the floodwaters receded. The basket drifted toward land and came to rest at the base of a hill, the Palatine. This moment, quiet and unobserved, would later be remembered as the first turning point in Rome's story. Rome begins not with rescue, but with survival. The myth tells us that the twins were found by a she-wolf, who sheltered and suckled them until they could be discovered by a shepherd. For later Romans, this image became sacred, reproduced in sculpture, coinage, and ritual. It was not simply a charming story. It was a statement about identity. The founders of Rome were nourished by something wild. In the ancient imagination, wolves were not gentle creatures. They were symbols of danger, hunger, and the untamed world beyond human order. To be raised by a wolf was to be marked by the wilderness itself. Rome, in this story, is not civilized from birth. Civilization comes later. First comes endurance. Whether the wolf was meant literally, metaphorically, or as a poetic memory of a foster mother does not matter as much as what the Romans believed it represented. They believed that their city had been shaped by forces outside human control. Nature itself had tested its founders and found them worthy. After the wolf comes the shepherd. The twins were taken in by Faustulus, a man of modest means, living close to the land. He and his wife raised the boys as their own, teaching them to survive in a world defined by labor, danger, and competition. There were no tutors, no royal privileges, no protection from hardship. This upbringing mattered. Rome's founders were not imagined as kings raised in palaces. They were imagined as men formed among flocks and fields, accustomed to risk and responsibility. Their authority did not come from ceremony. It came from action. As the twins grew, so did their reputation. They were strong, decisive, and capable of leading others. They gathered companions, young men drawn to confidence and resolve. Conflicts arose with neighboring shepherds. Fights broke out. Boundaries were tested and defended. In these early stories, Rome's future leaders are already acting like rulers, even without a city to rule. This period of their lives exists outside formal society. The twins are not yet bound by law, but they are already shaping order. They protect what is theirs. They punish those who threaten it. Leadership emerges naturally, through force of character rather than inheritance. It is here that we begin to see the pattern that will define Rome. Authority does not wait for permission. It asserts itself. Eventually, this world of hills and pastures collides with the structures of Alba Longa. One of the twins is captured during a conflict and brought before Numitor. What begins as punishment turns into recognition. Details align. Questions are asked. The truth surfaces. The shepherd boys are not who they seem. The revelation does not transform them. It confirms what they already are. When the twins learn of their royal lineage, they do not hesitate or doubt. They act. Amulius is overthrown. Numitor is restored. The cycle of usurpation is reversed. Yet the most striking part of this moment is what follows. The twins do not remain. They could have stayed in Alba Longa, accepted status, and ruled within established walls. They had blood, legitimacy, and support. Many stories would have ended here. Rome's does not. Instead, they return to the place where they had been abandoned, to the riverbank, to the hills, to the site where survival first replaced intention. This choice defines the city to come. Rome is founded not in comfort but in memory. It rises where its founders were exposed, tested, and shaped. The city is anchored not in royal inheritance but in resilience. The river remains central to this identity. Even as Rome grows, the Tiber never becomes fully controlled. It floods. It disrupts. It reminds the city of its limits. The Romans never forget that their fate is tied to forces beyond their command. And yet they build anyway. They drain marshes. They raise embankments. They cross the river with bridges. They turn danger into infrastructure. What once threatened survival becomes a source of strength. This relationship with the river mirrors Rome's relationship with chaos itself. Rome does not eliminate disorder, it absorbs it. The story of the wolf and the river tells Romans that their city was never meant to be sheltered. It was meant to endure. It was meant to be shaped by exposure, not protected from it. In later centuries, when Rome faced invasion, famine, and civil war, this origin story mattered. It reminded Romans that hardship was not a sign of failure. It was a return to form. Rome had survived abandonment once. It could survive again. By the time the twins stand ready to found their city, they carry this past with them. They are no longer children of the river, but they are marked by it. They have learned that survival precedes order and that authority must be claimed, not granted. The river has done its work. The wolf has done its work. What remains is the final step, transforming survival into structure. And that step will demand a choice, one that cannot be shared. The twins shared an origin, but they did not share a future. Raised together among shepherds, they learned the same skills, endured the same dangers, and earned the same respect. Their bond was forged not by comfort, but by survival. Yet even in these early stories, unity exists alongside tension. Equality in Rome's myth is never stable. Both brothers were strong. Both were capable. Both believed themselves suited to lead. As young men, they stood at the head of their followers, bands of companions drawn not by law or inheritance, but by loyalty. Leadership emerged organically, shaped by action rather than title. The hills around the Tiber were not peaceful, and authority belonged to those who could defend it. In this environment, rivalry was unavoidable. The twins were not raised within a city, and that absence mattered. Cities impose structure. They assign roles. They limit ambition. Outside the city, none of these constraints existed. Authority was personal, contested, and constantly tested. This is the world that shaped Romulus and Remus. Their relationship was close but never simple. Each had followers. Each had confidence. Each believed the future city should bear his vision. The myths do not describe one brother as clearly virtuous and the other as clearly flawed. Instead, they present two leaders whose coexistence becomes increasingly unstable. This tension reflects a deeper Roman concern. Romans feared division more than external enemies. Internal rivalry, especially among elites, would later tear the Republic apart. By placing fraternal conflict at the very beginning of their history, the Romans acknowledged a truth they would repeatedly confront. The greatest threat to Rome often came from within. When the twins decided to found a city, the question was not whether it would exist, but how it would be defined. Location mattered. Each brother favored a different hill. These hills were close enough to share a landscape, but distinct enough to symbolize separation. The disagreement was not trivial. In ancient belief, place carried meaning. It determined defense, identity, and divine favor. Choosing a site meant choosing destiny. Unable to agree, the brothers turned to the gods. Augury, the reading of signs, especially the flight of birds, was a sacred method of decision-making. It placed human ambition beneath divine judgment, or so it was meant to. Yet even divine signs could divide. According to tradition, Remus saw the first omen. Romulus saw more. Interpretation clashed. Numbers, timing, and meaning became points of dispute. The gods had spoken, but not clearly enough to resolve human rivalry. This ambiguity is critical. Rome's founding myth does not portray divine guidance as simple or absolute. The gods offer signs, but humans must interpret them. An interpretation, shaped by desire and pride, can inflame conflict rather than resolve it. As tensions rose, boundaries were drawn. Romulus began marking the city's sacred perimeter, the Pomerium. This was not merely a physical line. It was a spiritual boundary, separating the ordered space of the city from the chaos beyond. To cross it improperly was a violation not just of law, but of the divine order. Remus challenged this boundary. Accounts differ on his motive. Some say he mocked the walls. Others say he leapt across them to prove their weakness. In every version, the act is symbolic. It represents defiance of authority, of sacred order, and of his brother's claim. The response was fatal. Romulus killed Remus. Whether in anger, in defense of the boundary, or as an act of grim necessity, the result was the same. Rome's founding was sealed by fratricide. The city came into being through the death of one of its creators. The Romans never concealed this. They preserved the story, despite its darkness, because it explained something essential about their world. Rome was founded on law, but law required enforcement. Order demanded sacrifice. Boundaries mattered because violating them carried consequences. In this story, the city takes precedence over blood. This does not mean the Romans celebrated the killing. Later writers describe Romulus' grief. Some portray him as haunted by the act, but regret does not undo the foundation. Once the line is crossed, history cannot return to what it was. Rome chooses permanence over reconciliation. This moment marks the true transition from wilderness to city. Survival alone is no longer enough. Structure must be imposed, even at terrible cost. The city cannot exist if its authority can be mocked or ignored, even by its own founders. The myth offers no alternative ending. There is no version in which the brothers reconcile and rule together. Rome does not imagine itself as born from compromise. It imagines itself as born from resolution. This belief would echo through Roman history. Again and again, Rome would face moments where shared power fractured into rivalry. Again and again, the state would choose unity enforced by strength over division tolerated by mercy. The cost was often high. The result, often endurance. By placing this choice at the very beginning, the Romans framed their later struggles as continuation, not corruption. Civil conflict was not a betrayal of Roman values. It was a tragic expression of them. With Remus dead, Romulus stood alone. The city could now be named. The walls could now rise. The laws could now be spoken. Rome was no longer an idea shared between brothers. It was a reality shaped by one will. And from this moment onward, Rome would remember that its survival depended not on harmony, but on the strength to enforce order when harmony failed. The city had chosen its path, and it would never forget the price of that choice. With Remus dead, the question of leadership was no longer disputed. But Rome had not yet been founded. The killing resolved rivalry, not purpose. It cleared the path, but it did not build the city. What followed was not triumph, but responsibility. For the first time, Romulus stood alone, not merely as a survivor, but as a founder. This distinction mattered. A survivor endures circumstances. A founder creates them. The decision to establish a city was not simply about settlement. People already lived in the region. Huts stood on hills. Shepherds moved through the land. Trade passed along the river. What Romulus set out to do was different. He aimed to transform scattered life into structured community. To do this, Rome needed more than walls. It needed legitimacy. In the ancient world, cities were not considered real unless they were recognized by gods as well as men. A city without divine sanction was vulnerable, not just militarily but cosmically. Its laws carried less weight. Its boundaries could be ignored. Its survival felt uncertain. Romulus understood this. The founding of the city began with ritual. He marked the sacred boundary, the pomerium, with deliberate care. This act was both symbolic and practical. The line separated what belonged to the city from what lay beyond it. Inside, order would prevail. Outside, the wilderness remained. Crossing this boundary improperly was not a minor offense. It was an attack on the city's identity. In later Roman thought, this moment defined what Rome was meant to be. A space governed by law, sanctified by tradition, and defended by force if necessary. The city was no longer just a place to live. It became a moral and religious entity. The walls that followed were modest, but their meaning was immense. They represented permanence. Until this moment, everything about Rome's story had been provisional. Survival depended on movement, adaptability, and response to threat. Now, Romulus committed to staying, to holding ground, to defending a fixed space against all challengers. This commitment was risky. A settled city could be attacked, besieged, and destroyed. A mobile group could flee and adapt. By choosing permanence, Rome accepted vulnerability, but it also claimed authority. From this point on, Rome would be something others had to reckon with. Romulus did not rule alone in silence. He created institutions. The myth credits him with establishing Rome's earliest political structures, assemblies, councils, and social divisions. These were not democratic in the modern sense, but they imposed hierarchy and order. Roles were defined. Authority was distributed, even if unevenly. This was another deliberate choice. Rome did not imagine itself as ruled purely by force. Even its first king was bound by custom and expectation. Law did not replace violence, but it constrained it. Power was exercised within a framework that others could recognize and eventually inherit. The creation of law was also an act of memory. By establishing customs and rituals, Rome ensured continuity beyond its founder's lifetime. The city would not collapse with one man's death. It would endure through shared practices that outlived individuals. This concern with continuity appears early and often in Roman tradition. Rome was not built for a single generation. It was built to persist. Yet one problem remained. The city lacked people. A city without population is an idea, not a reality. Fields must be worked. Walls must be defended. Children must be born. Rome, newly founded, faced a severe imbalance, especially between men and women. This imbalance threatened Rome's future more than any enemy. Romulus' solution was radical. He declared Rome an asylum. Fugitives, exiles, debtors, and the unwanted were welcomed. Those fleeing justice elsewhere found protection within Rome's boundaries. This policy shocked neighboring communities. Cities defined by lineage and tradition did not easily accept outsiders. Rome did. This decision reveals a defining feature of Roman identity. Rome did not ground belonging in ancestry. It grounded it in participation. Loyalty to the city mattered more than origin. Those who accepted Rome's authority could become Romans, regardless of where they came from. This openness was not generosity. It was strategy. Rome needed people who would fight for it, work for it, and believe in it. By offering inclusion, Rome gained strength. By absorbing outsiders, it grew quickly and unpredictably. This policy also reinforced the meaning of the pomerium. Inside the boundary, identity changed. A fugitive became a citizen. A stranger became part of something larger. Rome transformed people as much as it gathered them. But inclusion came with cost. The city's rapid growth created tension with its neighbors. Rome appeared unstable, even dangerous, a place where social norms dissolved and order was reinvented. Suspicion grew. Conflict followed. Rome was still fragile. Yet Romulus pressed forward. He named the city Rome, binding it to his own name and legacy. This act did more than label a place. It personalized the city's origin. Rome would always remember that it began with a single will imposing structure on chaos. This personalization was risky as well. A city named after its founder risked becoming inseparable from him. If Romulus failed, Rome's legitimacy might fail with him. But the myth insists that he succeeded because he understood something essential. Rome could not be built gently. It required hard choices, exclusion of some, inclusion of others, boundaries enforced, violence remembered, law imposed. The decision to found Rome was not portrayed as heroic inspiration. It was portrayed as burden. Romulus inherited a city born of blood, and he accepted responsibility for shaping it into something durable. This moment marks the true beginning of Roman political thought. Power exists to preserve the city. Law exists to sustain power. Identity exists to bind people to both. From this foundation, Rome would grow, not smoothly, not peacefully, but persistently. The city now existed. But existence alone was not enough. To survive, Rome would soon need to defend itself, expand its influence, and confront the consequences of the choices made at its birth. The founding was complete. The struggle had only begun. Even after a city is founded, certainty does not arrive all at once. Rome had walls. It had a name. It had a king. But it did not yet have peace of mind. For the Romans, no human action, no matter how decisive, was complete without divine approval. The gods were not distant observers. They were active participants in the life of the city, communicating their will through signs, rituals, and omens. To ignore them was to invite disaster. This belief shaped Rome from the very beginning. Although Romulus had prevailed over his brother and established the city, the memory of their dispute lingered. The disagreement had not been purely political. It had been religious. The city's location, its authority, and its future had all been contested through competing interpretations of divine signs. That tension did not vanish with Remus' death. Instead, it became embedded in Rome's identity. Augury, the reading of signs, especially the flight and behavior of birds, was one of the most sacred practices in Roman religion. It was believed that the gods revealed their approval or disapproval through these signs. Yet augury was never mechanical. It required interpretation, and interpretation required judgment. This left room for disagreement. In the founding myth, both brothers sought divine guidance. Both believed the gods favored them. Both read the signs in ways that confirmed their own claims. The conflict that followed was not presented as sacrilege. It was presented as ambiguity. The gods spoke, but not clearly enough to prevent bloodshed. This ambiguity mattered deeply to later Romans. It suggested that divine will was not always obvious, and that human responsibility did not disappear in the presence of religious ritual. The gods might guide, but they did not absolve. Decisions still had consequences. Rome was founded with this uncertainty built in. From the beginning, Romans understood that sacred signs could divide as easily as they could unite. Religious authority, like political authority, could be contested. What mattered was not merely receiving signs, but enforcing their interpretation. This belief would echo throughout Roman history. Later magistrates, generals, and emperors would all claim divine favor. Omens would be consulted before battles, elections, and major decisions. Yet disagreement over what the gods intended would remain a constant source of tension. Rome's founding myth prepared its people for this reality. The city was not born from unquestioned divine command. It was born from contested meaning. This explains why Roman religion became so procedural. Rituals were precise, offices were formalized, priesthoods were regulated. The goal was not spiritual ecstasy, but stability. If the gods' will could be ambiguous, then the process of interpreting it had to be disciplined. Rome responded to uncertainty with structure. But structure did not eliminate division. The memory of Remus lingered as a warning. He represented the path not taken, a Rome that might have been founded elsewhere, ruled differently, or defined by alternative values. His death closed those possibilities, but it did not erase them. Instead, they survived as unease. In some versions of the myth, Remus becomes a symbol of mockery, one who underestimated walls and authority. In others, he is portrayed more sympathetically, as a challenger silenced too decisively. The coexistence of these versions reveals Rome's discomfort with its own beginning. The city did not fully resolve the moral weight of its founding act. And perhaps it never tried to. Romans did not seek moral purity in their origins. They sought continuity. What mattered was that Rome endured, not that it began without fault. The presence of unresolved division within the founding story served as a reminder that unity was always fragile. This fragility shaped Roman political culture. Disagreement was expected. Rivalry was normal. Conflict was inevitable. What mattered was not the absence of division, but the ability to survive it. Rome's institutions would later be built around this assumption. Power would be shared but contested. Authority would be limited but enforced. Religious legitimacy would be claimed but debated. The city learned early that stability did not come from consensus, but from managed conflict. The founding myth also reinforced the idea that boundaries mattered. Remus, transgression, leaping the wall, was not simply an insult to his brother. It was an insult to the city itself. The wall symbolized order. To cross it improperly was to deny the city's authority over chaos. This belief would shape Roman law. Boundaries, legal, social, and sacred, were treated with extreme seriousness. Citizenship defined who belonged inside the city's moral order. Laws defined what actions were acceptable within it. Violations were punished not only to deter crime, but to reaffirm structure. Rome did not see punishment as cruelty. It saw it as preservation. In this way, the memory of early division became instructional. It taught Romans that authority must be defended, even when doing so carried moral cost, that hesitation could be fatal, that the survival of the city outweighed personal bonds. These were not comforting lessons, but they were enduring ones. As Rome grew, it would absorb new peoples, new gods, and new customs. Diversity would increase, tension would follow, yet the city would repeatedly return to its founding logic. Disagreement must not be allowed to fracture the whole. The omens that once divided brothers would later divide senators, generals, and emperors. The difference was that Rome now had mechanisms to contain that division, at least for a time. In the founding myth, those mechanisms are still forming. Romulus stands as both victor and burden-bearer. He carries the weight of divine ambiguity and human responsibility. The gods have not absolved him. History will judge him by what follows. Rome has been founded, but it remains exposed. Its legitimacy is real yet contested. Its unity exists yet rests on unresolved loss. Its gods have spoken yet left room for doubt. This tension does not weaken Rome. It defines it. The city moves forward not because uncertainty has been eliminated, but because it has been accepted as permanent. Rome does not wait for perfect signs or unanimous approval. It acts, and then lives with the consequences. The omens have been read. The city stands. What comes next will test whether it can endure not only division within its myths, but division within its growing population. And that test will arrive sooner than Rome expects. Rome's founding is often remembered as an act of creation. But before it was that, it was an act of destruction. At the center of the story stands a killing, not hidden, not denied, but preserved. The death of Remus is not treated as an unfortunate footnote or a later embellishment. It is presented as foundational. Rome begins with murder, and the Romans never forgot it. This choice is revealing. Most civilizations soften their origins. They emphasize harmony, divine blessing, or heroic unity. Rome did the opposite. It placed fratricide at the heart of its story, ensuring that every retelling began with loss. The first crime in Roman history is not theft or betrayal. It is the killing of a brother. Ancient sources offer different versions of the event. In some, Remus mocks the newly marked walls, leaping over them to prove their weakness. In others, a supporter of Romulus strikes the fatal blow. In still others, Romulus himself acts directly, declaring that anyone who violates the city's boundaries will suffer the same fate. The details shift. The meaning does not. In every version, the act is tied to the boundary. The wall represents more than defense. It represents order, an assertion that the city is sacred and that its limits matter. To cross it improperly is to deny the city's authority over chaos. Remus, death, transforms the boundary from symbol into law. Words alone could not establish Rome's permanence. The myth insists that blood was required. Once the boundary is defended with life, it becomes real. The city is no longer hypothetical. It is enforced. This is a disturbing lesson, and the Romans did not attempt to make it comfortable. Later Roman writers wrestled with the implications. Some expressed sorrow, others framed the killing as tragic necessity. A few tried to shift responsibility away from Romulus, yet none erased the act itself. The story endured because it explained something the Romans recognized in their own history. Rome was built through conflict. Again and again, Roman expansion would follow the same pattern. Boundaries would be drawn, resistance would test them, violence would follow. What began at the city's foundation would repeat across Italy and eventually across the Mediterranean. The first murder was not an exception. It was a precedent. This does not mean the Romans glorified fratricide. They understood its cost, but they believed that survival demanded decisiveness. Hesitation, in their view, invited dissolution. The city could not afford ambiguity at its core. In this logic, Remus becomes more than a victim. He becomes a warning. His death teaches that no one, not even a founder's brother, stands above the city. Personal bonds yield to collective survival. The city, once established, becomes sacred in a way that individuals are not. This principle would later define Roman law. Citizens were bound by duties as well as rights. Treason was treated as the highest crime because it threatened the integrity of the whole. Punishment was severe not because Romans were uniquely cruel, but because they believed the alternative was collapse. The memory of the first murder gave this belief weight. It reminded Romans that their city did not emerge from innocence. It emerged from choice, and choice carries responsibility. By preserving the story, Romans forced themselves to confront the moral complexity of their own endurance. Rome was not morally pure. It was resilient. This distinction mattered. A city founded on purity risks disillusionment when reality intrudes. A city founded on acknowledged violence expects hardship. Rome did not imagine itself as exempt from suffering. It imagined itself as capable of bearing it. The killing also resolves the final ambiguity of leadership. Until this moment, Romulus' authority could still be questioned. Remus' presence represented an alternative. His death ends debate. The city now has a single founder, a single voice, and a single will. Unity is achieved, not through agreement but through elimination. This is a harsh truth, and the Romans did not disguise it. Instead, they embedded it into ritual memory. The boundary defended by blood became inviolable. Later generations treated Rome's sacred limits with reverence precisely because they were born from sacrifice. Even centuries later, the idea persisted that the city's survival required vigilance. Laws could be reformed, institutions could change, but the core principle remained: Rome must not be divided against itself. The first murder also reframes the earlier story of abandonment. The twins were once cast into the river, exposed to death by political fear. Now, one of them becomes an agent of death in service of political order. The story comes full circle. Power that once threatened life now claims it. This symmetry reinforces the myth's internal logic. Rome begins and endures through cycles of threat and response. Those who survive early chaos learn how to impose structure later. The wilderness produces founders capable of harsh decisions. The story does not ask the audience to approve of the killing. It asks them to understand it. This distinction is crucial to Roman historical thinking. Romans were less concerned with moral absolution than with explanation. Why did Rome act as it did? Why did it become what it became? The answer lay not in idealism, but in origin. The first murder explains Rome's later contradictions. How could a city that prized law also wield brutality? How could a state that valued order repeatedly descend into civil war? How could Rome condemn tyranny while repeatedly empowering strongmen? because Rome was born knowing that order and violence were inseparable. This knowledge did not make Rome gentle. It made Rome enduring. By preserving the memory of Remus' death, Rome ensured that no generation could fully forget the cost of unity. The city's greatness rested on decisions that could not be undone, only carried forward. The wall still stood. The boundary still mattered. And the city, now truly founded, carried within it the memory of the life it had taken to exist. The first murder was complete. What followed would test whether Rome could transform this violent inheritance into something lasting. With the city founded and rivalry resolved, Rome entered a new phase of its existence. Survival had given way to governance. For the first time, Romulus was no longer simply a leader among companions or a victor in conflict. He was now something more complex and more dangerous. He was king. Kingship in Rome's founding myth is not portrayed as an honor. It is portrayed as a burden. Romulus does not inherit a peaceful city or a stable population. He inherits a fragile community held together by shared danger, recent violence, and uncertain legitimacy. To rule such a city required more than strength. It required structure. Romulus' first task was to transform a collection of followers into a people. This meant defining roles, responsibilities, and expectations. A city could not function if authority existed only in the person of its founder. Power had to be distributed, carefully, unevenly, but visibly. According to tradition, Romulus established Rome's earliest political institutions. He selected leading men to form a council, later remembered as the Senate. These men were chosen not for equality, but for status, age, and influence. Their role was advisory, not sovereign, yet their presence mattered. It signaled that Rome would be governed not by impulse alone, but through consultation and precedent. This balance between authority and counsel would define Roman politics for centuries. Even Rome's first king did not rule entirely alone. Romulus also organized the population into groups, divisions that structured military service, civic duty, and social identity. These divisions reinforced hierarchy, but they also created belonging. To be Roman was not simply to live inside the walls. It was to occupy a recognized place within the city's order. Law in this early form was inseparable from custom. Rules were not written. They were enacted, repeated, and remembered. Behavior was shaped by example as much as by punishment. Authority was reinforced through ritual, ceremonies that reminded the people that Rome's order was sanctioned by both tradition and the gods. Religion played a central role in this process. Romulus was not only king, he was also Rome's chief religious authority. He oversaw sacrifices, festivals, and rites that tied the city's political life to divine favor. This dual role reinforced the idea that Rome's laws were not arbitrary. They reflected cosmic order as well as human necessity. In Roman thought, separating religion from politics was unthinkable. To obey the king was also to respect the gods. To violate the law was to disrupt more than social harmony. It was to offend the divine. This fusion gave Rome's early authority a sense of inevitability. Yet for all this structure, Rome remained vulnerable. The city's population was growing, but unevenly. Its people were diverse in origin, background, and loyalty. Many had come to Rome not out of devotion, but necessity. They were fugitives, outsiders, and men with little to lose. Holding such a population together required constant reinforcement. Romulus ruled decisively. The myth portrays him as firm, sometimes harsh, but purposeful. He enforces boundaries. He punishes transgression. He rewards loyalty. Mercy exists, but it is secondary to stability. This portrait would later influence how Romans understood leadership. A good ruler was not one who avoided conflict. It was one who preserved the state. Personal virtue mattered less than effectiveness. Compassion was admired, but not at the expense of order. Romulus' reign also established a crucial precedent. Rome was not ruled by divine kingship alone. Romulus, though sometimes described as the son of a god, governed as a human ruler subject to expectation and judgment. His authority was immense, but not infinite. The presence of councils, customs, and shared rituals imposed limits, even if informal. This early model laid the groundwork for Rome's later suspicion of absolute power. Kingship in Rome's memory was necessary at the beginning, but dangerous if prolonged. Romulus' success did not erase the risks inherent in concentrated authority. It merely postponed them. As Rome stabilized, it began to look outward. The city's location, population growth, and internal organization made conflict with neighbors inevitable. Rome was no longer a marginal settlement. It was a rising power, and rising powers attract attention. Romulus did not retreat from this reality. He embraced expansion as a means of survival. Rome could not remain isolated. It needed allies, land, and influence. These goals would soon bring the city into direct confrontation with surrounding communities. But before Rome could fight as a state, it needed something else. Continuity. A city founded by one man risks collapsing when that man is gone. Romulus understood that Rome had to outlast him. Its institutions, customs, and identity had to be strong enough to endure leadership change. This concern appears even in the myth of his death. Romulus does not die quietly. He disappears, taken, according to tradition, into the heavens. Whether this was meant to imply divine ascension or political assassination, the ambiguity is telling. The founder vanishes, but the city remains. Rome does not depend on his physical presence. By the end of Romulus' reign, Rome is no longer merely a refuge for the displaced. It is a functioning political entity. It has laws, rituals, leadership, and a sense of itself as something distinct and enduring. The transformation is complete. A city born from abandonment and blood now stands as an organized community bound by shared identity. This does not erase the violence of its origin. It builds upon it. Rome has learned how to govern itself. But governance alone will not secure its future. The city's survival will soon depend on how it manages growth, conflict, and the consequences of its earliest choices. And those consequences are about to arrive, through war, marriage, and the uneasy merging of peoples. Rome had been founded. Its walls stood. Its king ruled. Yet the city faced a problem more dangerous than enemy armies. It lacked balance. From the beginning, Rome's population had grown quickly, but unevenly. The asylum policy that had filled the city with newcomers brought strength, labor, and manpower, but it also created a community dominated by men. Warriors, fugitives, and exiles were abundant. Families were not. A city without families has no future. Without marriage, there could be no stable households. Without children, there could be no inheritance of customs, no continuity of identity, no next generation bound to the city by birth rather than necessity. Rome's openness had solved one problem and revealed another. Neighboring communities watched with suspicion. Rome was young, unstable, and already aggressive in its recruitment. Its neighbors had something Rome needed: women, lineage, and established social bonds, but they were unwilling to share them. From their perspective, Rome was not yet a city worthy of alliance. It had no ancient pedigree, no respected traditions, no guarantee of stability. To marry into Rome was to risk absorption into an experiment that might collapse. Romulus' response was decisive and controversial. He invited neighboring peoples to a festival, presenting it as a religious celebration and a gesture of goodwill. Guests arrived expecting ritual, spectacle, and diplomacy. Instead, they were met with force. At a signal, Roman men seized the women of the visiting communities and carried them away. The event would later be remembered as the abduction of the Sabine women, though women from multiple groups were taken. The act shocked the ancient world and unsettles modern audiences just as deeply. Yet the Romans preserved this story without apology. They did not frame it as a misunderstanding or an accident. They presented it as a calculated act born of necessity. Rome could not survive without families. Peaceful negotiation had failed. Force became the solution. This is not a story of romance. It is a story of survival. The women were not killed. They were integrated. They became wives, mothers, and citizens. According to the myth, Romulus himself addressed them, promising honor, legal standing, and a place within the city. The Romans emphasized this point. The women were not treated as spoils. They were incorporated into Rome's future. Their children would be Romans. Their status would be protected by law. This distinction mattered deeply to Roman self-image. Rome did not see itself as a city that conquered merely to dominate. It saw itself as a city that absorbed. Even acts of violence were framed as steps toward integration rather than exclusion. Yet violence remained violence. The abduction triggered war. The neighboring communities did not accept the loss of their daughters quietly. Armies gathered. Battles followed. Rome, still fragile, faced enemies on multiple fronts. This moment tested everything the city had built. Its walls, its leadership, its unity. The war reached a climax when the opposing forces met in direct confrontation. Rome's survival hung in the balance. Victory was uncertain. The city could still be erased from history. Then the women intervened. According to tradition, they stepped between the opposing armies, wives to Roman men, daughters to the attackers. They pleaded for peace, arguing that victory on either side would mean their own destruction. If Rome fell, they would lose their husbands. If their fathers fell, they would lose their past. Their plea succeeded. Peace was negotiated. The warring peoples were united. Rome did not merely survive the conflict, it expanded through it. The former enemies became partners in a shared city. This resolution is central to Rome's founding myth. Violence initiates the crisis. Integration resolves it. The women, once abducted, become mediators. Their bodies mark the point where conflict transforms into community. Rome grows not by annihilating its rivals, but by incorporating them. This pattern would repeat throughout Roman history. Cities were conquered, but their elites were often preserved. Peoples were defeated, but many were eventually granted citizenship. Rome expanded less by erasing difference than by reorganizing it under Roman authority. The myth presents this not as idealism, but as pragmatism. Rome did not believe purity made a city strong. It believed inclusion, managed, controlled, and enforced, created durability. Outsiders became insiders not because Rome was benevolent, but because Rome needed them. This belief reshaped Roman identity. To be Roman was not to belong to a single bloodline. It was to participate in a shared project. Loyalty mattered more than origin. Obedience to law mattered more than ancestry. This openness also created tension. A city built from outsiders is always negotiating its identity. Traditions must be invented. Customs must be standardized. Authority must be constantly reaffirmed. Rome's early history reflects this struggle. The city never fully resolved the question of who truly belonged. Instead, it learned to live with it. The founding myth presents this ambiguity as strength. Rome is never static. It is always becoming. Each new group absorbed reshapes the city slightly without dissolving its core. That core is not blood. It is order. The abduction of the women, disturbing as it is, serves a specific purpose in the story. It explains how Rome moved from isolation to integration, from imbalance to continuity. It acknowledges violence without pretending it was accidental, and it frames compromise not as weakness, but as survival. Rome does not emerge from this episode innocent. It emerges larger. Families now fill the city. Children grow up knowing Rome as their home rather than their refuge. The city's future is no longer dependent on constant recruitment from outside. It can reproduce itself. The outsider city becomes a generational city. This transformation marks a turning point. Rome is no longer merely a settlement held together by force and fear. It is becoming a society, complex, diverse, and durable. Its identity remains unstable, but its foundations are stronger than before. The city has learned how to turn crisis into cohesion. But this success carries its own consequences. A city that grows through conflict must learn how to manage the memory of that conflict. Rome's future will depend on whether it can reconcile its violent beginnings with the order it now seeks to preserve. That tension will never disappear. It will define Rome for centuries to come. The war that followed Rome's founding did not end with victory or defeat. It ended with memory. The abduction of the women had secured Rome's future in the most immediate sense. Families formed. Children were born. The city gained continuity. But the violence that made this possible could not simply be forgotten. It demanded explanation, both to Rome's neighbors and to Rome itself. This is where the women take center stage. In Rome's founding myth, the women are not silent figures carried along by events. They become agents of reconciliation. Their intervention does not erase the violence that preceded it, but it transforms its meaning. They stand between fathers and husbands, between past and future, between destruction and survival. This moment is one of the most revealing in Roman mythology. The women's plea reframes the conflict. They do not argue in terms of honor or revenge. They argue in terms of continuity. They point out that any outcome based on total victory will destroy the very people the war is meant to defend. If Rome falls, they lose their present. If their fathers prevail, they lose their future. Peace in this telling is not idealism. It is necessity. The resolution that follows is not a return to the world as it was. The communities do not separate again. Instead, they merge. Former enemies become allies. Power is shared. The city expands, not just territorially, but socially. This integration is presented as deliberate. Rome does not apologize for what it has done. It legitimizes it by incorporating those it has harmed into its political and social structure. The women become the connective tissue that binds separate peoples into a single city. This is deeply unsettling. And that discomfort is precisely why the Romans preserved the story. They understood that their city was not born from mutual consent. It was born from imbalance, force, and negotiation after the fact. The myth does not deny this. It confronts it. But it also insists on something else. Rome believes that violence alone cannot sustain a city. Force may initiate change, but only integration can stabilize it. This belief becomes one of Rome's defining characteristics. Throughout its history, Rome will conquer cities, defeat armies, and impose its authority. But it will also extend citizenship, preserve local elites, and absorb foreign customs. The founding myth provides a template for this behavior. The Sabine women episode explains why Rome sees reconciliation not as weakness, but as strategy. Unity achieved through negotiation is not betrayal of strength, it is the completion of it. The women's role also reveals how Rome understood gender and power within its own mythology. The men act through violence. The women act through mediation. This division does not grant women formal authority, but it assigns them moral leverage. They become guardians of continuity. Without them, Rome would collapse into endless retaliation. Their presence turns a cycle of vengeance into a shared future. The myth uses this moment to establish Rome as a city capable of self-correction. Violence creates crisis. Crisis demands response. Response produces a new order. Rome does not remain trapped in its founding brutality, it builds upon it. But the memory remains. The story is retold not to celebrate the abduction, but to explain the peace that followed it. The women's intervention becomes a moral pivot point, allowing Rome to claim legitimacy without denying its past. This is crucial. Rome does not attempt to cleanse its origins, it reinterprets them. The city acknowledges that it began through acts that would otherwise delegitimize it. But by presenting reconciliation as part of the same narrative, Rome argues that its greatness lies not in innocence, but in endurance and adaptation. The women's children become symbols of this transformation. They are born of violence, yet raised within order. They inherit a city shaped by conflict, but stabilized through integration. Their existence validates Rome's claim that even flawed beginnings can produce lasting institutions. This idea would resonate deeply in later centuries. When Rome faced internal division, between patricians and plebeians, between generals and senators, between emperors and rivals, it often returned to the logic embedded in its founding myth. Conflict was expected. What mattered was whether it could be resolved without destroying the whole. The Sabine women's story also reinforces Rome's belief that identity is negotiable. These women do not choose between being daughters or wives. They become both. The city does not demand exclusivity. It absorbs contradiction. Rome grows by allowing overlapping loyalties to exist within a larger structure. This flexibility becomes one of Rome's greatest strengths. It allows the city to expand without requiring cultural uniformity. Local traditions survive as long as they submit to Roman authority. Difference is tolerated, sometimes encouraged, within a framework of control. The founding myth does not claim this is moral purity. It claims it is survival. By elevating the women's role, Rome also acknowledges that its endurance depends on forces beyond military might. Families, memory, and shared future matter as much as walls and armies. The women ensure that Rome is not merely a conqueror's camp. They ensure it becomes a society. And yet, the myth never lets the audience forget how this society began. The peace achieved is fragile. It rests on the acceptance of what cannot be undone. The women do not reverse history, they live within it. Rome learns to do the same. This acceptance becomes part of Roman resilience. Rather than seeking redemption through denial, Rome seeks stability through acknowledgement. The city carries its origin story forward, using it to explain not only its greatness, but its recurring struggles. The Sabine women episode is not a happy ending. It is a settling. A recognition that survival often requires living with the consequences of earlier choices. Rome does not imagine a future free from conflict. It imagines a future capable of absorbing it. With this episode, the founding myth reaches its final transformation. Rome is no longer a city of exiles alone. It is no longer defined solely by force. It is becoming a composite community, uneasy, diverse, and durable. The violence that began Rome's story has not disappeared. It has been folded into its structure. And in doing so, Rome claims a final truth about itself, that unity is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to survive it together. By the time Rome had grown into a city of power and influence, its beginnings were already distant. Centuries separated the Rome of emperors and marble monuments from the Rome of huts and shepherds. Written records were scarce. Archaeological traces were fragmentary. Memory, more than evidence, shaped how the past was understood. Yet Rome never abandoned its founding story. Instead, it preserved it, refined it, and repeated it, generation after generation. This persistence raises an important question. Why did this version of the past endure? The answer lies not in historical accuracy, but in usefulness. Rome's founding myth was not designed to explain exactly what happened. It was designed to explain why Rome was the way it was. It offered a framework through which Romans could understand their values, justify their institutions, and interpret their own contradictions. In this sense, myth functioned as cultural memory. It selected certain events, emphasized particular themes, and arranged them into a narrative that made sense of Rome's experience. Other possibilities were forgotten. Others were reshaped. What remained was not random, it was intentional. The story of Romulus and Remus explained Rome's obsession with boundaries. The city's walls were not just defensive structures, they were sacred lines. Crossing them improperly was a crime against the state itself. This belief can be traced directly back to the first murder, where violation of the boundary demanded death. Rome's legal culture inherited this logic. Law was not merely a system of rules, it was the foundation of order. To undermine it was to invite chaos. This belief would shape Roman attitudes toward crime, punishment, and authority for centuries. The myth also explained Rome's uneasy relationship with violence. Rome celebrated law, citizenship, and civilization, but it never denied that force played a central role in securing them. By placing violence at the beginning of its story, Rome acknowledged that its power rested on hard choices. This honesty mattered. A city that denied its violent past risked hypocrisy. A city that acknowledged it could claim resilience. Rome chose the latter. Its myths did not excuse violence, but they contextualized it. The figure of Romulus embodies this tension. He is a founder and a killer, a lawgiver and a brother's murderer. Rome did not attempt to resolve this contradiction. It embraced it. Leadership in Roman thought was morally complex. Authority demanded sacrifice, not only of others but of innocence itself. This understanding shaped Roman political culture. Roman leaders were expected to be decisive, not perfect. Success was measured by stability, not moral purity. This expectation would later influence everything from republican magistracies to imperial rule. The myth also explained Rome's inclusiveness. By portraying the city as a refuge for outsiders from its earliest days, Rome justified its practice of absorbing conquered peoples. Citizenship became a tool of expansion rather than exclusion. Loyalty mattered more than origin. This approach set Rome apart from many of its rivals. Where other cities guarded identity through lineage, Rome expanded it through participation. The founding myth provided a precedent for this openness, framing it as necessity rather than generosity. The Sabine women episode, in particular, offered a powerful lesson. It taught that integration could follow violence, that reconciliation was possible without denying the past, that unity did not require uniformity. Rome could grow without erasing difference, as long as authority remained centralized. This lesson would be repeated across the empire. Local customs were tolerated. Local elites were preserved. Rome ruled not by homogenizing its subjects, but by binding them to a shared structure. The myth explained why this approach was not weakness, but strategy. Memory also played a political role. Roman leaders invoked the founding story to legitimize their actions. Claims of defending the city, protecting its boundaries, or restoring order all drew authority from the past. By aligning themselves with Romulus, later rulers placed their decisions within a sacred tradition. This use of myth was not deception. It was continuity. Rome believed that the past and present were linked through example. What had worked once could work again. The founding story became a reference point against which new crises were measured. even disagreement over details, did not undermine the myth's power. Different authors told different versions. Some softened Romulus' guilt, others emphasized Remus' defiance. Yet the core elements remained: conflict, choice, sacrifice, and survival. These themes mattered more than precision. The myth endured because it resonated with lived experience. Rome's history was marked by civil war, political rivalry, and repeated reinvention. Each generation saw its own struggles reflected in the founding story. The past did not feel distant; it felt familiar. When the Republic tore itself apart, Romans saw echoes of fraternal conflict. When emperors claimed absolute power, Romans remembered the dangers of kingship. When boundaries were threatened, Romans recalled the sacred line first drawn by Romulus. The myth provided a language for understanding crisis. It also provided restraint. By remembering that their city had been founded through loss, Romans were reminded that greatness carried cost. This awareness did not prevent brutality, but it tempered triumphalism. Rome's identity included humility, not in innocence but in endurance. The city had survived worse before. This perspective helped Rome persist through centuries of change. As institutions evolved, as territories expanded, and as leadership transformed, the founding myth remained a constant. It anchored Rome's sense of itself, even as the city reinvented its structures. Rome did not seek to escape its past. It sought to live up to it. In doing so, it demonstrated a unique relationship with history. The past was not a relic to be admired or ignored. It was a guide, a warning, and a justification. The myth of Rome's founding was never just a story about beginnings. It was a statement about identity. It told Romans who they were, what they valued, and what they were willing to endure. It explained why Rome could rule others without losing itself, and why it could survive internal collapse without disappearing. The story endured because Rome needed it. Without it, the city would have been a collection of events. With it, Rome became a continuous narrative, one that connected the first wall to the last emperor. And so, long after the hills were built over and the riverbank transformed, Rome continued to tell the same story. Not because it was simple, but because it was true enough. Rome's founding story does not end with certainty. It ends with acceptance. By the time the city had walls, families, laws, and memory, the violence that gave birth to it had already passed into legend. But legend, for the Romans, was not a way of forgetting. It was a way of remembering with purpose. Rome never pretended that its beginnings were pure. It did not claim that harmony came first, or that justice emerged fully formed. Instead, it preserved a story of exposure, rivalry, bloodshed, and compromise, because that story explained what Rome would become. A city shaped by conflict. A society built through integration. A state defined by endurance rather than innocence. In telling this story, Rome made a quiet declaration about itself. It declared that survival mattered more than comfort, that order mattered more than consensus, that the future mattered more than the past, even when the past could not be undone. The founding myth does not excuse Rome's violence. It contextualizes it. It does not celebrate suffering, but it refuses to deny that suffering played a role. Rome chose to believe that greatness was not the absence of fault, but the ability to persist despite it. This belief would carry Rome through centuries of transformation. Kings would fall. Republics would fracture. Emperors would rise and disappear. Yet the city endured, not because it was unchanging, but because it was adaptable. Rome learned early that identity was not fixed. It was constructed, defended, and revised over time. The story of Romulus and Remus provided a framework for this understanding. When Rome faced civil war, it remembered that division was not new. When Rome imposed law through force, It recalled that order had always required enforcement. When Rome absorbed outsiders, it saw precedent rather than threat. The founding myth offered explanation without absolution. It allowed Romans to see their own contradictions reflected in their origins: law and violence, unity and exclusion, inclusion and dominance. These tensions were not flaws introduced later, they were present from the beginning. And because they were present from the beginning, they could be endured. Rome's story suggests that civilizations are not born from ideals alone. They are born from choices, often made under pressure, often imperfect, often irreversible. What matters is not whether those choices are flawless, but whether the society built upon them can survive their consequences. Rome believed it could. That belief became self-fulfilling. The city's founders did not imagine peace without struggle. They imagined continuity through struggle. They accepted that loss would accompany creation and that stability would require sacrifice. This worldview shaped Rome's legacy. It produced remarkable achievements and immense suffering. It created law, roads, cities, and institutions that would outlast the empire itself. It also normalized conquest, hierarchy, and control. The founding myth does not ask us to admire Rome uncritically. It asks us to understand it, to see how a people explain their own endurance, to recognize how memory can shape identity, to observe how stories, repeated long enough, become foundations as real as stone. Rome did not begin because destiny demanded it. It began because people chose to believe that it should exist, and were willing to live with what that choice required. In this sense, Rome's true foundation was not a date. It was a decision to impose order where none existed, to draw boundaries and defend them, to integrate outsiders rather than remain small, to remember violence rather than erase it, and to endure. That decision echoes far beyond the banks of the Tiber. It reminds us that civilizations are not judged solely by how they begin, but by how they carry their beginnings forward. Rome chose to carry its past openly, conflicted, imperfect, unresolved. And in doing so, it ensured that its story would never be forgotten. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.